Good morning. I now call the Standing Committee of Government Operations back to order. My name is Frida Martzelos, and I am the chair of the committee. I will begin by asking members of the committee to introduce themselves. This morning's meeting is being broadcast and live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels to respect physical distancing requirements. Non-committee members and officials from the Office of the Auditor General and the Department of Education, Culture and Employment are attending by video conference. The Standing Committee on Government Operations is conducting a review of the report of the Auditor General of Canada to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly on early childhood to grade 12 education in the Northwest Territories, Department of Education, Culture and Employment. As part of this review, committee will hear today from the Auditor General of Canada, Karen Hogan, about the results of the Independent Auditor's Report. Following that, committee will hear from representatives from the Department of Education, Culture and Employment about their plan to respond to the results of the Auditor's Report. Committee members will have an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. I will now just have the committee introduce each other, starting with, on my left, with MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Caitlin Cleveland, and I'm the MLA for Cam Lake.
My name is Lisa Semler, and I'm the MLA for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Rocky Simpson, MLA for Hay River South.
Do you want to introduce yourself, please, MLA O'Reilly?
Thanks, Kevin O'Reilly.
Good morning, Ms. Hogan. Before you begin your opening remarks, I would like to discuss how the meeting will proceed. All comments, questions, and remarks should be directed to myself as the chair. Both members and witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. This process is required to allow the committee clerk to turn on and off people's microphones. Ms. Hogan, it is a pleasure to welcome you to your first appearance before this committee, even if it is virtual. I hope that soon we will have a chance to meet in person. Please proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on early childhood to grade 12 education in the Northwest Territories. The report was tabled in the Legislative Assembly on February 6, 2020. Joining me are Glenn Wheeler and Maria Pooley, who are members of the audit team. In this report, we looked at whether the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment managed early childhood to grade 12 education so that programs and services were equitable, inclusive, and reflective of Indigenous languages and cultures. Overall, the department did not meet all of its obligations, including ones set out in its ambitious plans to renew the education system. We found shortfalls in the department's actions in every area that we audited. In addition, the department did not know whether its efforts were improving student outcomes. For example, the department's progress to support Indigenous language and culture-based education was slow. In 2011, it committed to working with regional education bodies to increase the number of qualified language instructors. However, it did not assess how many instructors were needed or for which languages. The need for swift action is increasingly critical because the knowledge of Indigenous languages is declining. We also found that the department did not monitor inclusive schooling to know whether students were receiving the supports they needed to participate in the regular education program in their communities. Moving to equitable access, the department failed to address some other commitments, including improving support to teachers in multi-grade classrooms. The department did, however, introduce some initiatives to improve access to education across communities, such as junior kindergarten and northern distance learning. For daycare programming, the department did not track the training needs of operators and staff to understand how to best support them. The department also did not provide sufficient guidance to operators on how to help prepare preschoolers for success in schools. The department did not have a clear picture of the performance of the education system because of problems with how it collected and analyzed data. For example, we found that the department's analysis overestimated the high school graduation rate. A decade after our first audit in 2010, we found there were still gaps in the outcomes between students in smaller communities and those in regional centers and Yellowknife, as well as between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Sufficiently analyzing student data would help the department better understand the actions it could take to help improve student outcomes. We are deeply concerned by our findings, given the importance of education for children. The department must take steps and work with regional education bodies and other partners to ensure that the education system improves student outcomes, including closing the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, as well as between students in smaller communities and students in larger centers. An entire school year has passed since our audit was completed, and we have not audited the actions taken by the department since then. Your committee may wish to ask departmental officials questions on the action plan they prepared to address our recommendations. Madam Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. We will now open the floor for questions. MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the focus of the scope rather of the audit that was just performed by the Auditor General of Canada is different than the scope that was performed in 2010. And I'm wondering if the Auditor General's office could speak to the difference in scope and how they chose the scope for this audit. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Cleveland. Auditor General Hogan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The member is correct that our scope was different. This is not a follow-up audit. In a follow-up audit, we would normally look at the same areas and determine whether or not progress was there. While we did look at some similar areas, we did change our scope a little. I will ask Glenn Wheeler to perhaps give you a few more details on what some of those specific changes were.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Auditor General is correct. The scope of this recently reported audit was quite different from 2010. In 2010, that was our first audit of the education system in NWT, and we looked at everything from daycare to elementary, secondary education, Aurora College, and adult training. In monitoring developments in education over the years, it became apparent to us that one of the key areas that required our attention was JK to secondary schooling, because one of the things that we noted in 2010, and I think that still is true today, is that it's very important that kids get a good foundation when it comes to education. Only by getting a good education early on are kids eligible for post-secondary education and training they need to be able to flourish in the economy. In particular, childcare, or early childcare education and elementary education are very important because, again, they're foundational. So when we were trying to scope this audit, we decided to focus on 4 areas that we thought were very important in this regard. Inclusive schooling was a key area. Equitable education was a second area. Indigenous languages and cultural education was important too, and that we had made some very serious observations regarding Indigenous languages in 2010, and the last area was childcare. So that gives the committee some background as to why we focused on the areas we did. And we also looked at how the department is monitoring the progress of the education system and meeting its objectives and in obtaining its intended results. So there are also some observations in that area. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Supplementary, MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. One of the things that I definitely agree with and think is a key area in need of focus is the equitable access to quality education, especially between Yellowknife and the smaller communities. But within Yellowknife here, the concern is that it doesn't become a zero-sum game where in order to improve the access to equitable education in smaller communities, that it comes at the expense of students within the regional centers or within Yellowknife. And so what is the kind of best recommendation of the Auditor General's report to ensure that the efforts being made in the regional centers and in Yellowknife are still preserved while we're increasing the equitable access to education within small communities? Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler, would you want to answer that?
Madam Chair, as the members indicated, equitable access is a key issue and something that we spent a fair amount of time on in our audit. Our overall conclusion in this area was that although the department had implemented programs to improve equitable access to quality education, more work needs to be done. The department should be commended on rolling out junior kindergarten across the territory as of 2017-2018, and we found some good work in the area of northern distance learning. That was something we first noted in 2010. It was only in its infancy at that point in time, but in the intervening years it's become a full-fledged program, and it's being rolled out to more and more communities, and it gives students in high school access to those courses they need to go on to post-secondary education. Having said that, we did find some issues that are of concern to us, and where we made recommendations to go to the committee members' point. I think the key issue for us was providing support to principals in small schools and in multi-grade classrooms, because it's in small communities where one often finds the greatest challenges in providing equitable access. And the department took some preliminary steps in that area, but a lot more work needs to be done to ensure that teachers, principals in those small schools and in the small communities have the tools necessary to ensure that kids that are growing up in these small communities have access to the same benefits that students in larger areas such as Yellowknife has. Equitable access doesn't necessarily have to mean the same thing everywhere, but it does suggest that if kids in smaller communities and schools in smaller communities aren't able to get some of the benefits that schools in larger communities have, that the department needs to explore alternative ways to ensure that those schools get the support that they need. So we make a recommendation with respect to giving additional supports to principals of small schools and teachers in multi-grade classrooms. Madam Chair.
MLA Semler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, when I look at the 4 areas that the audit targeted and focused on, what do you feel is the biggest concern of the audit to you out of the 4 that you targeted?
So, Mr. Wheeler, do you want to answer that question?
Madam Chair, I would be pleased to start, and then I would ask my colleague Maria Pooley to add to what I would say. In all four areas, we found issues. So it's difficult for us as auditors to say there's one area that requires more attention than others. If we look at Indigenous language and culture-based education, for example, we noted the progress has been quite slow in rectifying or addressing deficiencies that we identified back in 2010 and that the department itself identified in subsequent years. And as we note in our report, every year that passes where improvements are not made to Indigenous language and culture-based education, it's a lost opportunity to strengthen the teaching and the use of Indigenous languages across the territory. I just spoke to the issue of equitable education. I might ask my colleague Maria Pooley to speak a little bit to the issue of inclusive schooling and what we found in daycares in terms of areas that require improvement.
Go ahead, Ms. Pulley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would say that all of the four areas that we really focused on are of great importance, which is exactly the reason why we included them in our audit. And it's really important for the department to make some tough decisions to see where they think that they should prioritize within these areas or within the broader education system and things that we might not have looked at. I would say, speaking to equitable education, it's important that nobody gets left behind. And that is also a reason for inclusive schooling to be so important. And so giving some of those additional supports to communities that are struggling, maybe to attract teachers or some of those other challenges that are in remote communities, would be an important thing to focus on to help those small schools and the teachers in those schools and the administrators to ensure that every student has a chance to have the highest quality education possible. In regards to daycare, again, it's a really important area because there are lots of ways for children to acquire the skills and the knowledge that they need to be successful in life, in school and outside of school, whatever path they choose to take. But if you're in a daycare, then there are certain things that need to happen, and one of those is a quality program. And so we feel that it's really important that the department is able to keep track of what's happening in those daycares, to be able to support the ones that need support, to make sure that young children are able to acquire the skills and the knowledge that they need to go on into the school system or into other aspects of life and be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Supplementary, MLA Zimler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I see that, like, and that's what I figured the answer would be, that we would have areas of that they're all important. The one area that I know my colleague had talked about was equitable education. And, you know, when the history of the way the schools went, we went from having regional centers where everybody came in the high school, which, you know, maybe we did have a higher graduation rate then. But did you see anything in the reports that you identified, or when you were doing your audit, that looked at the amount of money that went to the regional centers versus how they support the smaller communities? And because I don't feel that changed very much, and I don't see it historically. So I'm just wondering, within that system, if we're going to be having schooling within the communities versus in the regional centers, there should be a huge shift in funding. And was that measured, or did you ever find that in your report? Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Zimler. Maybe we can ask Mr. Wheeler to answer that question.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the question. We did not look at the overall funding formula for inclusive schooling or any of the other formula that are used to provide funding to education bodies across the territory. It was not a focus of our audit work, and for the most part, when we do performance audits, we don't get into the issue of whether the funding formula are adequate or not. Often those decisions are of a political nature. Having said that, we do make a note that in the area of inclusive schooling, that the department did adjust its funding formula to offset the higher costs of living and providing education in smaller communities, and I think that helped level the playing field somewhat with respect to some of the challenges that are faced in smaller communities. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'd like to speak to the graduation rates. When I look back on the 10 years that you essentially reassessed using a different method, it seems that there's a consistent 20 to 30% kind of inflation of graduation rates there. Can I just speak to the ability for the department to adopt your method going forward, and what you see as the barriers there? I know you pointed out a number of kind of issues with the data collection, but is it as simple as us as committee asking the department to adopt a method similar to that you used? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Wheeler, would you want to answer that question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would start to answer the question. I would ask my colleague Maria Pooley to jump in. I think the key point that we make here is that the department, when we went in and did our audit, was already in the midst of rethinking how it calculated high school graduation rates. It was not a situation where the department was, by any stretch of the imagination, trying to mislead anyone with respect to graduation rates, but there were some assumptions that were made in doing the calculations up until this point in time, which inflated or overestimated graduation rates. And I think once the department came to fully appreciate the impact that these certain assumptions were having, it was more than happy to think about a way to represent the findings. I would add that the true cohort method is a method that's used in most jurisdictions across the country to get around some of the inaccuracies that some of the other methods of calculating high school graduation rates allows for. But I would ask Maria Pooley to add a little bit more flavor or detail to some of the assumptions that were made as the department was using the previous method for calculating high school graduations, and how the method that we used it provided a clearer, more accurate picture of success.
Ms. Pooley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the challenges that we had, or one of the concerns that we had with the way the department was calculating their graduation rate, was that it didn't allow for students who, I guess, dropped out of school during high school. And so that is the reason why it gave, in our opinion, an inflated rate. So when we followed students from grade 10 through grade 12, it also accounted for those students who didn't return and gives a more accurate picture. One of the problems that the department might have in doing that, and one of the reasons that they explained to us that they didn't use the attrition rate, was because it's not as consistent in the NWT as it is in some of the other jurisdictions across the country. So when they tried to do it for certain subpopulations of student, you ended up with a graduation rate that exceeded 100%, which obviously is a skewed percentage. However, the way that we did it, we were still able to account for attrition, but you'll note in our report that we call them non-returners. So there is a portion of that rate that accounts for people who not only dropped out of school, but also people who might have left the NWT. However, I'll draw your attention to Exhibit 4, where you can see at grade 10 there is a big spike in the non-returners, which we think still speaks to the fact that our rate is quite appropriate as a better measure for the graduation rate. a challenge the department might have, I'm not sure. I would expect they could work with the Bureau of Statistics to have the capacity to do this. We ourselves rely on our internal specialists who are data experts in doing these kinds of analyses. And so that is maybe something that the department would need to as well be able to do. But we do feel that there are ways you can get around some of those challenges with the and still allow for the attrition rate. Thank you.
Thank you. MLA, or supplementary?
Yeah, thank you. I guess my other question with the student cohort method is, in the Northwest Territories, one of the most common graduates are people who return to school years later, or we have plenty of people at school who are 24, 25. And I think, so the one method of, pegging it to 18-year-olds really wasn't a smart reflection, because we have people in high school who are up to 24 years old who have come back and return. And then I think the student cohort method on a localized level, like you said, reaches that overinflation. And you end up with a number of 110% or something. Can you just speak to how a method could factor in the fact that we have so many people graduating from high school, well past 18 in our territory? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Pooh?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There really is nothing to stop the department from including in the analysis students of any age. So in our Exhibit 3, for example, we give the overall territory-wide graduation rate over that period, and it comes out to 51%. That includes any student of any age who graduated during that time frame. So it really is just a matter of using that data in the analysis, and nothing precludes the department from including anybody of any age, as long as they have that information. Thank you.
Thank you. MLA O'Reilly, do you have a question?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think one of the findings of the Auditor General was that there needed to be some clear reporting around student outcomes, and I really didn't see very much about that in the my very quick review of the response from the department. I'm just wondering if they can comment on that. Thanks, Madam Chair.
So, Auditor General Hogan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you mentioned, there are many ways to measure the performance and achievement, and we recommend very much that the department focus on outcomes, because outcomes is an area where you truly measure the benefits to the students and to the communities, versus measuring outputs, which are typically ways of measuring activities that the department has done. I guess a simplified way I would put it is you measure progress over process, and that keeps the eye on the end game, which is improving the outcomes. The department did give a somewhat comprehensive action plan to address our recommendations. My suggestion would be that this would be an excellent question to ask the departmental officials when they appear before you afterwards, to help make the link on how they may modify or adopt new performance measures that would really truly be focused on outcomes.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. Supplementary, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think the department carries out these periodic EDI and MDI sort of measurements for, I guess, sort of looking at whether kids have any special needs and so on. How does that figure into the work that you did and what we should be looking for from the department? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Auditor General Hogan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We really touched in on that when we looked at the aspect of inclusive schooling. Every student, regardless of whether they have a learning disability or a physical disability, should be able to attend mainstream schools with their peers in order to improve their outcome and allow them to become, good contributing members to society. What we noted was that there was definitely more work that needed to be done around support services in schools, around individual learning plans and the support that students needed who have individual learning plans, because they are so key and essential to their success into the future. I will see if Glenn maybe would like to add some of the concrete individual items that we might have looked at over and above, just echoing the importance of making sure that there is adequate support for students, especially in smaller communities who have those individual learning plans.
Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Auditor General puts it well, and I would add that tools such as the early development instrument, some of the other mechanisms that the department uses to measure student success are all very important. Together they can provide a comprehensive picture of how well students are doing and where there are areas that require improvement. I think people working in this field would say that there's probably not any one indicator that will tell you everything to know. There's instead a basket of indicators or measures that need to be done in order to determine whether children are flourishing in the educational system and to measure and report on performance. We were happy to see that the department is making use of some use of its data in trying to quantify success. But as we note in the report, there's other data that the department doesn't use as comprehensively as it should. So there is some potential or opportunity for the department to do more work in this area. And it's important from another perspective as well, and that's that it's often when you're trying to identify areas of improvement or whether a new initiative is working, to get in early to do measurements so that you establish a baseline. So those kids for whom the early development instrument tests were done, the department has the advantage of having a baseline for those students, and then it has the potential to come back in later years and reassess them to determine whether, as a result of certain interventions or general exposure in the education system, that they have improved along those indicators. So it's important that the department continue to explore indicators that it can use to measure success. We were happy to see in the department's action plan that this continues to be an emphasis and where the department is going to be focusing significant future work. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Are there any other questions? MLA O'Reilly? MLA Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to switch to the work on daycares. I agree with many of the recommendations and the responses the department has set out here. But I guess one of my concerns is when I look at the NWT childcare, I would say probably a majority of it is not even in daycares or in the regulated world. Often this is still happening in people's homes. It's happening in housing. And I guess I get concerned when I look at the work we would need to do to bring our current daycares into both, training compliance and infrastructure compliance. We may just actually be pushing a bigger portion of our daycare operators into that unregulated world. And I think infrastructure is one of the big barriers here. And the report kind of speaks to that about, things not being up to fire codes and such. Can I just get a sense from how much you looked into the essentially daycares that aren't licensed daycares and any concerns the Auditor General's office has is if we go and add more requirements to this, whether we will actually just make less licensed daycares as an outcome. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA Johnson. Mr. Wheeler?
Chair. I'll start to respond to this question, and I'll ask my colleague Maria Pooley to add to it. Just a bit of a reminder that our audit in 2010 actually we did extensive work back at that time to determine what sort of work the department was doing to ensure that daycares were safe for children, whether the proper protocols and safety procedures were being followed. And we had some quite stark observations in 2010, serious enough that we followed up in 2012, and we're glad to see some improvement in that area. In this audit, we didn't focus as much on, if I could call it, the infrastructure or safety aspects of daycares. Instead, we focused on to what extent the department was supporting daycares in ensuring that the instruction that young children are receiving in these centers and in these facilities is putting them in a position where they're more, quote unquote, ready to learn when they enter the regular school system. So our observations were mostly focused on that, and they were negative in that we found that there wasn't a lot of support being provided, explicit support to help operators work on things like numeracy and literacy skills for kids. And I think the other area where we were quite we focused on in this audit, and we had some quite strong observations, was the lack of support the department was providing to operators, employees, to ensure that they had the proper training to help young children be in a position where they would be more ready to learn when they entered the regular school system. But I would ask Maria, she did a lot more detailed work in the area than me, if she would like to add anything, in particular the extent to which we looked at licensed versus unlicensed centers. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you. We didn't look at the unlicensed daycares because just by virtue of them being unlicensed, it becomes a challenge for us to know where they are and how to get at them, although I can recognize that there may be concerns in that regard from certain people. We looked at, as Glenn said, the educational components of the daycares because it was an audit related to education. So notwithstanding that there may or may not be challenges related to infrastructure, we weren't focused on that in this audit. I can appreciate your concern that over-regulating or adding more regulations or anything like that, which we're not suggesting is necessary, but that might create some challenges and people might want to move more to that unlicensed model. I'll draw your attention to the fact that there are, for example, when it comes to the qualifications, there is a mechanism within the regulations by which the department can acknowledge the fact that somebody is qualified to run a daycare or to work in a daycare without having gone through formal education, because we can appreciate that there are other ways that you can become capable of taking care of children and providing them with that early play-based education that daycares provide. One of our concerns was simply that the department doesn't have a consistent method to assess those people. So if the department would do that, then I would think that hopefully that would maybe lead to more people meeting the regulation requirements in that area and then not push them into the unlicensed world. The other aspect that we were concerned about is the tracking of the training needs or maybe challenges that some daycares are having in delivering the type of programming that the regulations require. And again, the reason that concerned us is that because the department is responsible for providing support in those areas to daycares, and we did find that they did that. Our argument is that if you track where those things are required, then you can better tailor the department's limited resources in a way that would hopefully be even more successful in supporting those daycare operators and daycare staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my question is in regards to, I guess, the global landscape now. When we received this audit, it was before we were in a global pandemic, before COVID. And so I just wanted to clarify with the Auditor General's office that, or whether or not they see that there is any reason why COVID would play a factor in delaying or achieving any of the recommendations involved in the report. Thank you.
Auditor General Hogan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, you're correct. As you noted, this audit was carried out and completed before our country locked itself down in the midst of a never-seen-before pandemic. And we're seeing all across the country the impact that is having on our youth and on their access to quality education. Some of the concerns that I might raise would be the continued need to focus in on good, stable, accessible, and affordable internet in the territories. If there is a need for a school to move more to a virtual platform. As we noted in our report, the pilot program on Northern Distance Learning saw some success in outcomes, allowing students who might have normally done self-learning online to be able to attend a classroom in a virtual form and have access to qualified teachers on subjects that might not be available in the smaller communities or in the territory. Again, I think it becomes one of those things that the department has to weigh in the balance of all the things that are a priority for them, and ensuring that no matter what form education might take, that it is still accessible to smaller communities as well as larger centers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. Alisa? No. Okay, seeing that there are no more questions, before we wrap up this portion. You told me you didn't want to ask a question. Okay, MLA Simpson, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the presentation and receiving and reviewing the report. But I would ask, do you consider during the audit or look at the individual impediments to the department meeting its goals, and if those impediments may be cross-departmental issue, and if so, has the department identified how they would address them? Because I guess when it comes to education, we can look at this narrowly, but we know up north there's wider issues, and that's social issues and other areas as well. So I just want to know if when you do the audit, if there's any consideration for other issues, and whether we're utilizing or we need to utilize, or the department needs to utilize the services of other departments to address some of the impediments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Auditor General Hogan?
Thank you. As you mentioned, there are many barriers to education, some that are very unique to the north. And I guess when I sit back and I look at education, it is really a big, broad partnership, and it's a partnership that includes the department, education bodies, students, parents, and communities. And so it is a challenge for all of those parties to come together. What we did look at was the responsibilities of the department. That is sort of where we can focus in on, and we are seeing that they are making some improvements to help eliminate those barriers, but continued focus on areas such as helping smaller communities, better access to Indigenous language and culture training are things that you can't let up on. So those are important matters to consider when you look at absenteeism. Trying to think of innovative ways to get around how different communities might have different reasons or different schedules and calendars for education. So again, making education equitable and inclusive doesn't mean that it looks the same in every single community. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for the department. I will see if perhaps Glenn, who is very intimate and knowledgeable on the education subject, if he would like to add something to that.
Madam Chair, I would like to add a couple of comments. I think the Auditor General makes some very important points about the fact that you shouldn't be looking at education alone. There are a lot of determinants to whether children succeed in the Northwest Territories or whether they won't. We speak in the audit report about the whole issue of the legacy of residential schools in the NWT. That's a very real issue that the department and education bodies have to deal with as they seek to achieve better results. I'd like to point out, and the member makes a very important point about the Department of Education, Culture and Employment perhaps doing work with other organizations. And we do note in the audit report at one point where the Department of Health and Social Services did some work with ECE on a child and youth care counselors program. And that was a very good development in that both ECE and Health and Social Services realized that they were dealing with issues that were within both of their mandates, and that by working together, they could realize greater success. And it's an important point in that in almost every audit we do in the Northwest Territories, we see examples of where the department we're auditing has or could take opportunities to work with other departments in order to better or more comprehensively deliver programs and services to residents. A prime example of that was the audit we did on Child and Family Services in 2018. That was a follow-up to our audit in 2014. And even though the observations we made in that report were quite negative, we were happy to see that the Department of Health and Social Services was starting to do more work with other departments across the territorial government in order to deal with the challenges that they were facing in providing services to children in care. So areas such as child and family services, education, corrections are areas where if multiple departments can be involved in trying to identify and pursue solutions, I think it will result in better services to residents. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Do you have a supplementary, Mr. Simpson?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Another issue with this department and other departments as well is that I see decisions are being made somewhat based on the liability to government, and policy is developed to limit that liability. Is this an area that the audit looks at and addresses? And do you find that it impacts education policy or delivery? Because it's we're always trying to we talk about liability, we try to protect, we're trying to protect the government while we're trying to make sure that that we're delivering a good education system. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So, Mr. Wheeler, do you want to answer that question?
I would be glad to start, and I would ask the Auditor General to perhaps add to my response, because it's a bit of a larger question or a larger issue. To respond to the first part of the Mr. Simpson's question, our audit did not look at decisions made from the lens of liability. We really did approach the audit from the point of view of what were the most important areas to focus on to improve children's experiences in school and the results that are being achieved. And we focused on education-specific components to education delivery. We didn't get at some of the other perhaps financial or legal components of the education system. But I might ask the Auditor General if she could add to that, because again, that's a bit of a larger question. Madam Chair.
Auditor General Hogan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We often get questions very much along this lines, and our mandate really does not take us to the area where we will comment on policy. We leave that to the policymakers. Where we focus on is how the department takes that policy and puts it into action. And we can recommend improvements on how they might gather data to inform good decision making, how they may use the data they have to inform the need to revisit or amend a policy when it isn't working. And so, departments really do need to focus on what they need to gather and how they gather it in order to have comprehensive information to make that decision, which at times might be difficult to suggest that policy needs to change. So really our focus needs to be on how they implement the policy that is there, and keeping them focused on outcomes that generally will improve the lives of individuals across the territory.
Thank you, Auditor Hogan. Are there any other questions? If not, seeing as there are no more questions, before we wrap up this portion of the meeting, I want to acknowledge Mr. Glenn Wheeler. On behalf of the committee, thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for your years of service to the Assembly and the residents of the Northwest Territories through your work with the Auditor General of Canada. You have been conducting audits in the Northwest Territories for more than 10 years now, and you have been a regular visitor to our communities. We understand this is the last time you will be appearing before our committee. I know members both past and present have appreciated your work ensuring that the government of the Northwest Territories is complying with its policies and legislation. On behalf of this committee, I want to thank you, Mr. Wheeler. And with that, I will ask for closing remarks from the Auditor General Hogan, and maybe Mr. Wheeler wants to just say goodbye to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your warm words are most appreciated. I must say it's been a pleasure this last 10 years, or 10 years plus now, I guess, to be doing audits in the Northwest Territories. I've been continually impressed with the professionalism I see in departments across the territory, without exception. Even though a lot of our audit reports have raised difficult issues and been quite negative, without fail, the managers we deal with in federal departments have been most professional. And I would like to also thank the members of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, present and past, for their support to our office, because these audit reports we feel are an important tool in accountability and transparency, and we appreciate very much the significance and the attention you give to them. So thank you very much again, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Closing remarks, Auditor General Hogan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just hope that as I embark on, I'm a few months into my 10-year mandate, that by the end of it, I will be as knowledgeable as Glenn on issues that affect Northwest Territories, and I look forward to working with your committee over the course of my mandate. Some of the closing remarks I would like to make is just to reiterate our concern with the findings in our report. Having access to a quality education really does provide an avenue for the youth to become contributing members to society, and so it is really a fundamental necessity of all youth across the country, especially in Northwest Territories. We are happy to see that the department accepted all of our recommendations and that they have provided a comprehensive action plan to address our recommendations. I acknowledge that the challenges that they face are serious, and that they will require some time in order to address properly. But it's with that continuous attention, the continuous follow-up that SCOGO can give to the department to ensure that they stay focused on outcomes, that you can hopefully really see some changes and improvements in the quality of education for the youth across the territory. So I thank you for inviting us today, and I look forward to working with the committee in the future.
Thank you, Auditor Hogan. We're going to take a 5-minute break so we can get into to take online our group from ECE. Okay, we're gonna call the meeting back to order for the Standing Committee on Government Operations. We will now hear from Ms. Rita Mueller, the Deputy Minister of the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment, on the response to the results of the Independent Auditor's Report. Ms. Mueller, the floor is yours. Your opening remarks and presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, thank you to you and the committee members to make this for this opportunity to make this opening statement and to respond to the Office of the Auditor General of Canada's 2020 audit report on early childhood to grade 12 education in the Northwest Territories. With me today is Mr. John McDonald, our Assistant Deputy Minister of Education and Culture, as well Mr. Sam Shannon, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Corporate Services, and Ms. Katie Pollock, our Director of Planning, Research and Evaluation. I would like to first express gratitude to the OAG audit team for their extensive review. The audit team took the time to work with our department as well as education body officials to better understand education in the Northwest Territories. The audit is more accurate as a result of these efforts, and the department appreciated the respectful and collaborative manner in which the audit team undertook this important work. The OAG audit explored a 4-year period starting April 1st, 2015 and ending on May 31st, 2019. It sought to determine whether or not our Department of ECE had planned, supported, and monitored the delivery of equitable, inclusive education programs and services that reflected Indigenous languages and cultures to support our students' outcomes and to close our key achievement gaps. The audit found a number of areas for improvement where ECE had not taken enough action at the time of the audit. ECE is committed to improving how we support residents and in particular our students in all aspects of their education. We recognize that there is always more that can be done, and we welcome the opportunity to receive impartial advice from the OAG. To this end, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment accept all of the audit findings, and we agree with the recommendations that were found within the report. I am pleased to be in a position today to share a short presentation which outlines our ECE proposed action plan to improve our student outcomes in the Northwest Territories. The action plan directly addresses the recommendations found by the audit. We also look forward to answering any questions that committee may have about either the findings or our proposed action plan. So thank you, Madam Chair. If just moving directly into the presentation, if we could go to slide 2. Slide 2 is really an overview of what we hope to cover in the next short while, and really just a very high-level overview of the audit, as well as an explanation that we've also completed our review of the Education Renewal and Innovation Framework, the 5-year review that we had set out to do. We would like to share and respond to what the findings and recommendation of the OAG and how we plan on responding to that, and then speak about our action plan and then answer any questions. If we could move to slide 3. Because we've already discussed much of the information on slide 3, again, I just want to focus our attention on the fact that really this audit was looking at how we're doing in inclusive schooling, in Indigenous language and culture-based education, the equitable access to quality education, and of course the programming, the staff qualifications, and the overall training in our licensed daycare centers. I would ask that we move to slide 4. The Education Renewal and Innovation Framework is the department's 10-year education strategy, and it runs from 2013 to 2023. It is focused, and the purpose of it was to reshape and improve our NWT education system from junior kindergarten right through to grade 12. It was launched in 2013 after numerous discussions, engagements, and meetings with many key education partners. It also was informed by an education renewal roundtable, as well as an Aboriginal Leaders Education Renewal Roundtable. And we also did a series of territorial engagements with students that were in our system. The ERI framework is also based on extensive research that was conducted by our department, and also took into consideration the history of education in the Northwest Territories and the current realities as of 2013 when we finalized this ERI 10-year framework. We also looked at best practices in education in the northern and in international context. And all of this research is summarized in our framework and can be found in Chapter 1, our context for change. The ERI framework at a very high level, it has 9 commitments that guide the actions of what we proposed over 10 years. And there's 8 foundational statements that serve as principles or really the values of the framework. And all of this can be found online within our department's website. If we could move to slide 5. The ERI evaluation occurred, our own evaluation occurred between February 2018 and August 2019. And it was meant to cover the first 5 years of the implementation of our ERI framework and action plan. So from the school years of 2013-14 to the end of the 2017-2018 school year. The objectives of the ERI 5-year evaluation were to meet the GNWT's planning and accountability framework requirement that had been set out for that 5-year mark. And it included all of the education bodies. Also, we, as I had mentioned, we had committed to do a review at the midpoint of the 5 years to reevaluate and then to readjust plans as needed. And really, that is the real main essence of it, was to inform this next 5 years, 5 school years, to see where we needed to make improvements and have new focus. Our ERI evaluation asked and answered 3 questions. What were the ERI goals and commitments, and how were they measured? How were the ERI commitments implemented, and what were the results of these ERI initiatives, and how did those initiatives contribute overall to trying to improve the education renewal and innovation that we were trying to make in our education system? And now, Madam Chair, with your permission, I would ask that the remainder of the presentation be completed by John McDonald. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We could be on slide 6, please. So I'll speak briefly on the OAG findings and the recommendations. So as the audit team discussed earlier, they looked at a number of critical areas of the education system, and the recommendations were as follows. Firstly, that ECE should work with education bodies to fully implement the Indigenous languages curriculum and recruit and train the number of required Indigenous language instructors required. Their next recommendation, number 34, was that ECE should update its guidance to student support assistants and provide them with adequate training to help ensure that students' needs are met. Recommendation number 45 was that ECE should identify what is required to provide equitable access to quality education for all students and take immediate action. This should include providing additional supports to principals of small schools and teachers of multi-grade classrooms. Recommendation 51 spoke to the fact that ECE should develop guidance that clearly sets out how daycare operators can develop programming that would meet the education requirements of the child daycare standards regulations. That ECE should also track daycare's compliance with programming requirements and track the training needs of daycare operators and staff. And lastly, that ECE establish a consistent method of assessing daycare staff and operators who lack formal qualifications to ensure they understand developmentally appropriate childcare practices and can apply that understanding to day-to-day daycare programming. And I'll note that ECE has agreed with all of these recommendations. Moving on to slide 7, please. And again, this is continuing to outline the OAG recommendations. The OAG examined how the department monitored the performance of the education system, including its collection and analysis of student data, performance against the ERI commitments that the deputy just outlined. And due to the timing of the audit, we would note that it did not reflect the work that the department undertook since May 2019 to implement the established planning and accountability framework, and specifically the ERI formative 5-year evaluation, which looked at the outcomes of the education system. The OAG recommendations in this area were recommendation number 62, which is that ECE should develop and use performance measures that adequately measure the performance of the education system on an ongoing basis and make the necessary modifications to its programs and services. Recommendation number 63 was that ECE should complete the midterm evaluation of the Education Renewal and Innovation Framework and refocus its efforts on actions that should prioritize in the final years of the framework. Recommendation number 64 was that ECE should monitor student progress on the Indigenous language acquisition, assess the adequacy of its curricula and culture-based education, and adjust its approach as needed. And lastly, recommendation number 65, ECE should strengthen its monitoring of inclusive schooling, and this should include conducting reviews of inclusive schooling practices, including spot checks on individual learning plans that students would use within schools. Also, ECE should analyze information, including information related to student need for specialized services, to assess whether students' needs are being met. And finally, make necessary adjustments to the education system in this area. And again, the department has agreed with all of these recommendations. Moving on to slide 8, please. So here I'll briefly summarize ERI evaluation findings and recommendations. And again, these findings or this evaluation was largely completed by our Planning, Research, and Evaluation Division within our department. And I think you'll note that there are many similarities and overlaps between the findings of this report and evaluation and what the OAG had found. So key finding number 1 was that student achievement gaps continue to persist across community types. So although there were some encouraging results related to student achievement, things like students at the high school level passing their core courses frequently, students reporting in the middle years, for example, that they feel a sense of belonging within schools and that they feel that their teachers accept them for who they are. That student attendance is something that has demonstrated to be marginally improved, and the teacher satisfaction rates were quite high. There are still, however, a number of outcomes across the system, particularly around student learning, that need a great deal of work. These outcomes were clear across a host of indicators that ECE uses to monitor the performance of the system. So earlier, one of the members mentioned the early development instrument, which is used to look at children's growth and their performance in the early years prior to school. The middle years development instrument that looks at student health and well-being in the middle years, and other indicators that are more of attendance or purely academic nature. What ECE found was that efforts are made to ensure that the same programs and services can be found regardless of community size or location. So in essence, there's been an effort on equality. However, we have concluded through this evaluation that equality is not the same as equity, and more efforts must be made to ensure that students, particularly those students who are Indigenous or who are in our smallest communities, are given additional supports, and the staff who support them as well. Our key finding number 2 is referred to as a high school bottleneck. So this is the bottleneck of student enrollment in grade 10, where many students do not fully transition out of grade 10, in part because of the way students are transitioned through grades 1 to 9, in some respects due to the nature of the inclusive schooling system within the broader education system. To improve outcomes of our students, the report recommends that we monitor and report on education programming overall, and specifically on the progress of students as they transition through the education system from grade to grade. Key finding number 3 found that ECE had overstretched resources. So there were 45 education renewal and innovation initiatives that were entertained or undertaken over the first 5 years of the framework. And that in many respects, that was more than the department had the capacity to effectively implement, and certainly more than our partners in education bodies and schools were able to manage from a change management perspective. With all of these initiatives and regular work occurring, the department's resources were determined to be overstretched, which impacts the ability for these initiatives to be designed, implemented, and monitored with quality. So the review recommended that we reduce the number of initiatives overall, especially those in early stages of design, look at our initiatives which are in existence and refocus on those and ensure that they're as effective as possible. And we think that we've attempted to make sure that this was addressed within the action plan, which we'll be speaking about later on. If we could move to slide 9, please. And this is a continuation of the ERI evaluation findings and recommendations. Key finding number 4 speaks to a lack of program planning. And I think what I would say is that coming out of the broad consultations and engagements that led to the Education Renewal and Innovation Framework, there was great excitement and interest in substantive system change. However, more work needs to be done by the department to ensure that any new initiative or existing initiative has the structure around it, whether it would be monitoring and evaluation plans, project management processes, etc. Key finding number 5 indicated that some initiatives were not as closely aligned with the original ERI aspirations and were not achieving the results that were intended. 9 case studies were selected for review under each of the commitment in the ERI framework. And most of the initiatives reviewed were meeting or on track to meet their objectives. However, some initiatives were not on track and needed to be canceled or removed from the action plan. Moving on to slide 10. So in slide 10, I'm speaking to our action plan to improve junior kindergarten to grade 12 student outcomes. So as mentioned earlier, both the Education Renewal and Innovation Evaluation, as well as the Oag Audit, generated several recommendations to improve student outcomes in the Northwest Territories. Most of these overlapped and were specific to the area of JK to 12 education. Rather than develop numerous action plans, we decided to combine them into a single action plan that focuses on improving the outcomes in the system. And this action plan is envisioned to allow ECE to finalize the Education Renewal and Innovation Framework and to see out the final years of that 10-year framework. So the actions in the action plan are categorized into 7 themes, and the first 4 themes are on the slide. And these are quality, early learning, and childcare. Theme 2, workforce development and capacity building. Theme 3, Curriculum and Student Assessment, and Theme 4, Student Supports. So I'll just quickly provide some examples of actions that are found within our action plan that address these themes. And I'll note that there are multiple actions within each of the themes to respond to those recommendations. So with respect to Theme 1, Quality Early Learning and Childcare, we are proposing to develop an early learning framework and supporting handbook for early childhood educators working within licensed childcare programs. For Theme 2, Workforce Development and Capacity Building, we are contemplating a junior kindergarten to grade 12 Indigenous language instructor employment plan to lay out a comprehensive plan to ensure that the education system has the next generation of Indigenous language instructors to meet the needs of the system and to support the Our Languages curriculum instruction throughout the system. Theme 4, Student Supports, we are proposing to provide distance learning opportunities in all Northwest Territory small schools by continuing to expand the Northern Distance Learning Program. Finally, moving on to slide 11, I'll just finish out the themes and some actions from the action plan. So the final 3 themes are Theme 5, Training, Developing, and Support for School Employees, Theme 6, Governance, and Theme 7, Monitoring and Evaluation. So under Theme 5, Training, Developing, and Support for School Employees, we're contemplating an action that would see us implementing an online educator certification and credentialing system, a case management system, for both early childhood and junior kindergarten to grade 12 educators. For Theme 6, Governance, as many members know, we are proposing to modernize the Education Act in consultation with stakeholders. And finally, under Theme 7, Monitoring and Evaluation, we're proposing to develop plans to analyze and share results of many of our indicators, such as EDI, MDI, and the Healthy Behaviors for School-Age Children surveys, and make sure that the public has an understanding of the performance of the education system going forward. So, Madam Chair, that concludes our presentation, and we look forward to answering any questions that members may have. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mr. McDonald, and also thank you to Deputy Minister Mueller for her presentation. We will start opening the floor to questions. Are there any questions? MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Department of Education for their presentation. My first question today is, I guess, in terms of equitable access to education and inclusive schooling and the recommendations that came out of the Auditor General's report to those. A lot of them focus on our education results and education focus within our small communities, and largely education is based, the Department of Education is based here in Yellowknife. And so I'm wondering, how is ECE working with Indigenous governments or organizations to address the recommendations from the Auditor General's report, and who are they including in that engagement, and how are they choosing who's involved in that engagement? Thank you.
Mr. McDonald.
Madam Chair, did you say Mr. McDonald?
Well, I thought he was going to answer, but you, Deputy Minister, you're welcome to answer the question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. So, in developing a response to both the findings and recommendations of the Auditor General, as well as our own 5-year education renewal, and as you have in front of you, our proposed action plan, the first set of key stakeholders, of course, are the education body superintendents and their staff, because whatever we are proposing, we know that it's really at the ground level in all of our schools and all of our communities where it has to be realistic and it has to be achievable. And because if not, then it just won't get done. And so when we, for your 2 points, about equitable access and inclusive schooling. Again, so much of that is trying to understand and recognize what may be the unique supports that a particular community or small communities need compared to regional centers or Yellowknife schools, as well as in inclusive schooling, really recognizing the types of support services that children who might have an individual education plan or a student support plan in their education system, regardless of what grade, what's available to them and how is that available to them. And so this proposed action plan that you have in front of you was really done in collaboration with our 8 superintendents of education. It was also shared with all of the chairpersons of the education authorities for their feedback, as well as the Northwest Territories Teachers Association, to get all of their feedback. And what you see right now is a product that, as far as our understanding and working with those groups, they feel that these not only address the areas of concern that we need to address, but also that the proposed actions will make a difference for students. And in the cases of teachers, you'll see much of the equitable access is really about recognizing that small community schools have unique needs compared to larger schools in the regional centers or in Yellowknife. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. A supplementary, Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my next question is in regards to, and I guess I'll use an example that Mr. McDonald presented here under Theme 1, Quality, Early Learning and Childcare. And it's in regards to kind of how we're measuring the action items out of ECE. And so a lot of times we look to things like, counting how many people took training, counting how many people basically checked boxes. And so I guess what my question is how is ECE going to take that and look at the outcome from those and evaluate the outcome so that we're not only tracking who took training, how much training they took, and what type of training they took, but also down the road of what effect that training had and whether we achieved what we set out to achieve. And so where does that measurement piece fit within the plan? Thank you.
Deputy Minister Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. I'll begin, and then I will ask if John can add further detail. But if I understood the question, it was mentioned about in early childhood, what we're proposing, and the member is absolutely right. As part of our regulations, we're required to know what the qualifications of every one of our licensed center staff are in licensed centers, and there are also stipulations for the kind of qualifications that, depending on the position, like a manager of that center has compared to others. What we really have recognized, though, is that, first of all, we needed to modernize a system for all of early childhood and JK to grade 12 so that we have a much easier way of tracking everybody who is in licensed centers and in our school system. Whether we call that early childhood certification or our JK to grade 12 teacher registrar, which we have in certification, but it's paper-based right now. And one of the steps that we want to do is modernize it, make it online, make it much more accessible to everyone in early childhood and JK to grade 12. Which means hopefully we will get information updated much quicker all the time as people are advancing their credentials in our early childhood system and our JK to 12 system. And as well, then what we know we need to do better at is to determine, based on the current credentials of early childhood practitioners and or JK to grade 12 teachers, where does the department have to focus? Where are gaps in training that we can offer, or in partnership with our education bodies, we need to concentrate to improve that skill or that knowledge of those practitioners or teachers for the overall goal of improving the quality of the programs that we're offering. That's one component. And the second thing that we're working on is developing this early learning framework for licensed centers. We have about 115 licensed centers throughout the Northwest Territories right now, or programs. And what the audit pointed out, and what we have been working on, is really trying to have a basic understanding and that framework that all staff would be working from, that incorporate evidence-based, play-based, and early learning and childcare approaches. So then we can set goals to say, this is the basic standard of quality early learning that we would like to see in all of those licensed centers. And with your permission, Madam Chair, I would like to ask John, perhaps if he could further elaborate on the aspect of how we're going to track that. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think the Deputy did a good job of outlining what we're envisioning, and where we certainly recognize some challenges that we've had in the past. In the action plan itself, there are, under the training and development theme, some actions that really specifically try to get to the heart of this. So one of those actions is for us to really renew the approach that we take to support the growth and the professional development of educators within the JK-12 system. And it's very similar in the early learning and childcare sphere. But we're looking at developing new competencies or professional standards for those educators within the system, and using them as the basis for our training and developing our annual training plan as a system. So, for example, educators would be looking at these standards, having clearer understanding of what is expected of them. They would be undertaking a process by which they are self-reflecting and receiving evaluation from their supervisor, and where there are identified needs, sort of at the aggregate, that would be where the department would focus its training efforts. So just to give you a concrete example, if a large number of teachers were indicating that they needed support with student assessment, that would be an area where we would respond and focus our resources accordingly. So that's an example of how we're hoping to address some of these concerns. And as the Deputy mentioned, we are developing and launching new systems to allow us to support training, both online, virtually, as well as to allow for collaborative opportunities for teachers, for example, or early childhood educators who are in various locations across the Northwest Territories to obtain training and to collaborate with colleagues so that they can learn and grow professionally. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I would just appreciate that your answers are very concise and to the point, so that we, it seems that one question and we're taking a half hour. So I just want to be cognizant of the time, and I want to make sure that we get everything from your presentation, but just very concise, and we would appreciate that. Okay, MLA Zemler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple questions, so I will go back on the list. So the first one I have is around the AOG's recommendation and the recruitment and training of the Indigenous language. You also have that within your themes, and I know this has come up as an issue. That we're, especially when I think of the territories and we're losing our language, and in my region we're losing our language up there, and it's hard to find language instructors. But those that we do have, that we've had in the system, there's policy barriers where I guess the way I can just be blunt, They feel that they're less important because, you know, if they're teaching Inuvialuktun immersion, for instance, we have somebody who can teach Inuvialuktun immersion kindergarten, and then you have a new grad coming in that's got a degree that comes in and teaches kindergarten in the next classroom. But because they've gone through like the TEP program and then the language program, they're teaching the exact same curriculum in an Indigenous language, but yet they cannot move up in their salary, and there's a barrier of policy there that makes them less. Where in my eyes, I feel that they should be paid more than the principal because we're losing the language. So I'm just wondering if that's going to be somehow looked at within your theme too. Thank you.
So, Deputy Minister Mueller, do you want to answer that question, please?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the question. So currently, we do not have that as something that you'll see in the proposed action plan right now. And if I could just mention that as far as the recognition of qualifications for anyone working in our JK to grade 12 system, that work is also done with the Northwest Territories Teachers Association, and it is part of a collective bargaining discussion as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Supplementary, Emma.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The other part, when we talk about language and culture, and, I mentioned this before, that, I find it difficult that, it's easy to put on paper that we're gonna incorporate this and we're going to do this, but when we're not taking a priority on like culture, we can have cultural instructors that are local who are I would consider them a PhD on the land, but yet we're not hiring them. And again, does this go to because they don't fall within the UNW, or we're not writing job descriptions that would meet the need, or they don't fall into an NWTT? It's these colonial policies that are putting these barriers, and our children are not getting this at home because of residential school, and then we're putting these barriers back into the school system that's preventing them from getting these excellent teachers that could be teaching them identity. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA Zemler. Deputy Minister Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. I would suggest that situation may be on a school by school, community by community basis. And the reason I say that is, I'm very pleased that our department implemented a JK to grade 12 a directive related to all things Indigenous language and culture-based education. And with that, it's highly encouraged that schools engage with, work with, and employ elders and also cultural experts in recognizing that there's, just as the member has said, these are individuals that have PhDs in their knowledge of the land and of particular skills. And so really our system is trying to emphasize and trying to promote the fact that schools are encouraged to have our community members with that expertise in our school system working with children. Thank you.
MLA, thank you, Deputy Minister Mueller. MLA Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to begin with the high school graduation rates. I appreciate the number of commitments the department is making to collect better data and really prioritize data. Although in looking to the responses, I still am not clear what method we'll be using for the high school graduation going forward. And I guess when I look at all the work that we got, for free from the Office of the Auditor General and the student cohort method, and they've already gone and shown us a method that gives us a more accurate result. My question is, will we adopt that method? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Deputy Minister Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. So prior to the 2017-2018 school year, the department was calculating our graduation rates by dividing the number of high school graduates within that given year by the number of 18-year-olds in the NWT the same year. And we were using that method, and it's our understanding that, in fact, other jurisdictions were using it as well. However, based on the feedback that we received from the audit, we have made changes. And I would ask, Madam Chair, that Katie Pollock could talk about those specific changes that we have made. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Mueller. Supplementary?
Further questions?
Am I okay to go ahead? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Madam Chair. So as the member notes, and as the Office of the Auditor General team notes, cohort method has been adopted by most jurisdictions in Canada. And we also worked on adopting this kind of a method. There are many different ways we can adopt a cohort method. So cohort just means we're taking one group and following them for a certain period of time. So the group that we chose the cohort that we chose to take was grade 12s enrolling at the start of the school year. And we looked at how many of those grade 12s enrolling at the start of the school year then graduated in the subsequent year. The reason we looked at this cohort instead of taking another cohort approach, including the one that the Office of the Auditor General used in their report, is, as the member mentioned, the NWT has different paths to graduation that many students take. So, for example, a student might leave the education system for a period of time and then choose to come back and complete their degree. And we wanted to recognize all of those paths as valid paths to graduation, and not exclude any students who are perhaps taking a different path, for example, longer than 3 years to graduate, who are exiting and then re-entering the system or otherwise. So this cohort method we call the grade 12 graduation rate. It is what we are using now for the department, and it's available online. We've got a fact sheet that describes the changes, why they took place, and what the historical revisions using that graduation rate looks like over the past 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Supplementary?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to see that. I guess just a note that I would encourage the department to amend their action plan to reflect that, because I think you just completely answered my question. We've come up with a cohort method. We've done the back data. It's actually available online, but I didn't actually know that in reading the response. So I'm very happy to hear that. My next question is, one of the issues we found with Auditor General's reports across departments is really there's a big flurry of work at the start, and then, it doesn't become prioritized. And that is partly the role of department, partly the role of the Auditor General's office in following up, and role of committee in holding the government to account. I think probably the best way to do that, there were some great lessons learned with the Child and Family Services audit, where they now have their action plan online. They're tracking it daily. There's regular reporting to the Social Development Committee. So I guess following this meeting here, we will refer this report to the Social Development Committee, but can I get a commitment that we will develop some regular reporting both to Social Development and perhaps in the annual business plan reporting as well? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Deputy Minister Mueller?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that question. And with your permission, Madam Chair, I feel that John McDonald could really speak about this. This is an area of his passion. If that's okay with you.
McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the member for that question. So in terms of a commitment, absolutely. We would be providing updates on the progress of this action plan to committee We've also prepared an online tracker to be added to our website that would be very familiar to you based on the Child and Family Services audit. As you mentioned, we've taken great care to ensure that our department business plan commitments are aligned with our action plans, so that even that you would be able to see familiar language and targets and benchmarks. So I think that this will be a focus for us going forward, and we're happy to provide those updates. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. With that, we'll go to MLA O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if I'm still muted or not.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'd like to start by saying complimenting the department, because this is the most detailed action plan I've ever seen in response to a performance audit. And it's so detailed. There's actually estimates of costing of some of the items in here. So that's really great to see. But I think it's also a reflection of the gravity of some of the findings that the OAG met. My question, Madam Chair, is I didn't see anything in here to reflect how we're going to adjust our school funding formula to address some of the needs that have been identified throughout the audit, particular the needs of schools in small communities. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Deputy Minister Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. I would like to refer this to Mr. Sam Shannon, our ADM of Corporate Services, please.
ADM. What's his name? So, Mr. The ADM of, I know, I see it now. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the members alluded to, there's a commitment out there that's in the GNWT's mandate for this assembly to conduct a review of the funding formula. What we're really aiming to do is tying this in with the modernization of the Education Act, so that the two pieces are kind of tied together and work hand in hand. As the member alluded to, certainly one of the priorities of that review is to ensure equity in funding and delivery of education for small communities and small community schools. Another aspect that we're going to focus in on, among many others, but a primary one, is ensuring that year-over-year fluctuations in enrollment aren't having a detrimental impact, especially on those small community schools. So we don't have any preconceived landing spots on where that review is going to go, but we're undertaking that work in simultaneous with the Education Act project. Thank you.
Thank you. What's his name again? Mr. Shannon. Do you have a supplementary to the question, MLA O'Reilly?
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. No, I'm glad to hear that there is going to be some review conducted of the funding formula. Maybe I can get some sense from the department how they intend to do that. I just knowing the way ECE works, I'm sure it's going to be done in a collaborative fashion with the education authorities. But I just a little bit more detail, because of course this could become a fairly contentious item. But just wondering how the department intends to work with the education authorities and parents, students themselves, and so on. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Shannon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we certainly intend on working hand in hand with education bodies, but beyond that, we intend on engaging as part of the Education Act project with Indigenous governments across the territory, with other key stakeholders such as students, parents at large, really all of our key players. So one benefit of tying this in or kind of having this run simultaneous with the Education Act review project is We will be conducting extensive engagements in all these, and we intend on using that forum to cover all of these bases in as much detail as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Are there any other questions? MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my question is in regards to tracking why students in the North leave school before graduation. And I know that from history that we typically lose a large amount of students by grade 10. And so I'm wondering if the department looks into why students are leaving, what they're doing instead, and if there were any suggestions from, specifically from the teachers working with the students at the time that may keep students in school. Thank you.
Deputy Minister Mueller?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for that question. We have not formally have a tracking mechanism for that bottleneck, perhaps that you're speaking about in grade 10, where we have students. That bottleneck, part of that is because students leave school and then come back, and they're starting, in trying to complete those grade 10 required courses. That's one aspect. We also know throughout our high schools that we have a number of young parents that when they have children, they are staying home with their children for the first year or two, which is wonderful. And then often coming back to school once their children are old enough to be in a licensed center, for example, early childhood program, or they're in school themselves. So that's definitely a factor throughout the Northwest Territories in many of our high schools. But a formal tracking mechanism we don't have right now. I would like to ask that John fill in any other information I might have missed. Thank you.
Is that John McDonald? Yeah, Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the deputy is correct that this is an area that is going to have to garner some attention from the department going forward. I think the only thing I would add is that some of our programs, which are also found within the action plan, such as the career and education advisors, child and youth care counselors, for example, will be now, because they exist, will be working with students in many cases on a one-to-one basis. And while student personal information is protected, we will be able to develop information and analysis from that program or those programs. So that will help us understand what may be informing student decisions around leaving or staying in school. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just in regards to that, I think it's valuable to track it, because I know when I was going to school in the North, our high schools had parenting programs. Our high schools had programs that supported parents within the school. And I know that there are some schools in the North, or in Yellowknife right now, that are kind of taking on that role again in order to encourage and support students that may be in that situation where they are having to support raising their own children while they're finishing school. So I think it's worthwhile tracking and looking into. And in the same respect, I'm wondering also what the department is doing in order to support kind of that transition between being a student in the North and then being a young adult in the North that has a direct role and a direct impact by, attending Aurora College, to be able to influence some of these numbers and help their peers or their younger siblings or the next generation be involved in school, whether it's through early childhood with Aurora College, or through teaching programs, or through Indigenous language coordinators. And so I feel like right now in a lot of our small communities, teachers are people who typically come from outside of the community. And I think there's a real need and a real empowerment opportunity for the whole, if you can see it, you can be it. And so how can we think outside the box to allow high school students the opportunity to become involved with Aurora College before they get to grade 11 and 12, so that that path becomes clear. And I know that you do have the career advisors, but I think there's a difference between talking to somebody about the potential and being able to kind of put your fingers into it and visit Aurora College and the Tabacha campus and maybe try a trade. And I know that Minister Simpson and I had a conversation about this on the floor of the House, but I'm curious to know what ECE is looking at doing in order to give kids that taste of opportunity. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think the member did mention the career and education advisors, and they are certainly one, I think, tool in the toolbox that we see as being able to support student transitions going forward. One-to-one counseling relationship is something that we see, and we've known it's been missing from our system. We also have, an example, I think, of what you're getting at with respect to dual credit and working with Aurora College on dual credit programming. So here in Yellowknife, we've been able to offer, or the college has been able to offer, a dual credit early learning and childcare course, which can be offered within the high school. So that, I think, is an example of some future collaboration as the college matures down its plan. We'll be able to work with them. We see ourselves as a key stakeholder with the college for a number of their programs that they're looking at going forward in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. MLA Zengler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple comments, and then I have one last question. One of the comments is with my colleague here, Ms. Cleveland, talking about the bottleneck. With my years that I've had, what we witnessed was the social passing, as most people will refer to, is they get into kindergarten, they get to grade 9, they're moved along without the proper supports in place. And that's kind of where we are today is we're not tracking, we're not following, we don't know what we really have done. We've got money for inclusive schooling. We don't know if we've spent it properly, but they get to grade 9 and then they have to switch into the Alberta curriculum for grade 10 and then have to pass these courses in order to get these credits. And they can't, and they struggle, and they drop out, and they come back, and they drop out, and they come back. So that's kind of, I just wanted to put that on the record because that was not said. The other comment I do have is under your theme 6 is governance, and it's what does modernize meaning? The Education Act, and then here it's got consultation with stakeholders. Myself, Madam Chair, you know what it was like to go through the consultation through the Health Authority when they became one. I do not want to see this with the Education Act becoming the bodies from the regions becoming not in charge, not in control of what's going on in their regions, like with the Health Authority any longer. So I just wanted to put that on the record for that. But the one thing that I do notice is that, and this is my question to the Deputy Minister or to the department, is we hire teachers and we know that the students in the smaller communities are the ones that are struggling. They're the ones that don't have the equitable schooling. But this is where we go and we put our newest teachers out of university. So they're coming from the south. They're not familiar with the north. We stick them in a small isolated community with all of the residential school legacy issues, and we expect them to just be able to teach these students and get them to where they need to be in 12 years and graduate. I look at the health system. We don't put new grads into the health center because we would put patients and our residents at risk. We're putting our students at risk because we're putting in new grads. There's got to be a better way to do this and not be, even if it means that to work, and I know that it's hard to hire, and I know what it's like to be at the board level and trying to fill positions before school starts. So, but there's got to be a better plan and better way to support these teachers if they are going to be the ones going into the small communities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So, Deputy Minister Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that those comments and that question. So yeah, I mean, I'm not disagreeing that many in our smallest communities, if teachers stay for 3 or 4 years, it's really it's wonderful, and because the turnover rate is quite fast and quite high. I will share what we have been doing to try to support our teachers, and in particular recognizing that some are brand new right out of school, as the member has suggested, as well as we have teachers coming in that are at the end of their career as well. And with both of those spectrums, there are pros and cons. We have implemented a new to the north orientation for all new teachers coming into the NWT to teach. It's a 3-day program, and even during the pandemic, we offered it to all of our teachers. We have a big uptake on that, and they did it while they were in their hotel rooms self-isolating. But typically it's done in person. Part of that is an orientation to the legacy of residential schools as well for one of those 3 days. We also, as part of this action plan, you're going to see that we completely agreed with the Auditor General's findings, as well as our own in ERI, that we have to do a better job in helping our teachers from small communities, because they're multi-grade teachers and they're teaching often 2 or 3 grades at a time. And so that is our commitment, and we are doing that. We are going to provide very targeted training for those multi-grade teachers. And as well, there's recognition that the principals in our small communities, they need, on top of the already established principal training that we have in the Northwest Territories, that's under our legislation, that's required. We also know and have heard, and the audit pointed out, that we have to do a better job of supporting small community school principals who are not only principals, but they're teaching often full-time or half-time as well. So we do have a commitment to make changes for the training and supports for those small community school staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Are there any other questions? No. I just want to make a couple of comments as chair. I don't think that the Deputy Minister answered some of the questions to MLA Zemler when it came to the importance of cultural inclusion by people that do not have degrees and languages. And if you don't have to answer it now, but we'd like something in writing, I think that has to be addressed within the system. These people have long backgrounds in cultural and language experience, and they have to be recognized. So I'd like to see that included in a written reply. I also would like to see, with all the DAs across the territories, you must have reports and commitments on who is doing what and who is not doing what, and so we could have comparisons on their reporting. Because I know in the South Slave we have excellent, I'm very proud of the DA in the South Slave. And I just hope that everybody else in every other jurisdiction across the territories feels the same way. But there's no comparisons. So I would like to see comparisons done with all the DAs so that we can have a better look at it at our committee, with our committee work. Because there must be some disparities. That's why some people are bringing it up. And I know there's a lot of disparities on the landscape in the small communities. So I just want to make sure that if you have some of those kind of reports available, as a chair, I'd like to have a look at them along with my committee. And with that, if we don't have any other further questions, maybe you can just comment on that quickly, and then we will proceed to the closing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So yes, we'll respond in writing as you've requested. And just to clarify, if I may, what you're looking for is in writing how our school system is incorporating our local cultural experts into our schools. If that's the first my first understanding of what you'd like to see in writing, and as well, you're asking about how we look at the DEAs and how we work with the DEAs, perhaps, and I would imagine that includes what type of training opportunities are available to DEAs. If that's, I'm looking for clarity if that's what you meant, Madam Chair.
I'm sure that, Deputy Minister Mueller, that you have reports on all the different DAs, and I'm sure that there are some disparities. I know in the South Slave, I'm very, very satisfied with what I see there and how they operate with small communities. I just want to make comparisons with the Yellowknife ones, the ones that the other DAs, the Inuvik ones, you know, and how allocations are done to make sure that the smaller communities are getting their fair share and are able to use education is so important to the development of a child that we have to make sure that, and it's in this report, you know, from the Auditor General that, you know, inclusive schooling, Indigenous language and culture, the four main areas. So I want to make sure that you must have some statistics on each DA and where it was lacking or not lacking, and I'd like you to share that with us. Thank you. Do you just want to just comment on that, and then we'll close up the meeting?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that clarity. So, yes, what we would be pleased to share with committee is something actually that our minister tabled yesterday, the floor of the House, which is the annual reports of planning and accountability of each of our education councils, and so that's how that's reported, and we'll be pleased to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing there's no further questions, I would like to thank Ms. Mueller and the officials for joining us today. We are pleased to see a plan in place to respond to the independent auditor's report. Committee will consider all that we have heard today, review the department's action plan, and will report the results of our review in the February-March sitting. This report may include comments or suggestions from committee on how the department proposes to respond to the auditor's findings. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn. MLA Zimler, thank you. So we adjourn.